I want to talk about the most exciting thing I've done in my life. In the early 90s, I had a chance to go on an assignment to Cambodia. That was a life-changing experience. A lot of people have been to Cambodia now, but back then it was still a tough part of town. There were landmines everywhere, and I was there with a group called Doctors Without Borders. We had a clinic in the jungle, and this was just a great experience for me. I went by myself. There was a doctor, Richard Heinzel. He was a McMaster grad, and I worked at the Hamilton Spectator, and I did some work for the Medical Post. And this doctor was trying to start up Doctors Without Borders in Canada. He had worked for them in Belgium during the Persian Gulf War. So he was getting field experience in Cambodia, and I thought it would be a great story to do for the paper and some magazine work and that. So I went on my own. He'd been there for a while, and I went on my own and met him there. So this was before the internet. Things were done by fax, which kind of made it all more difficult. I flew into Bangkok, first time in Bangkok. Then from Bangkok flew into Phnom Penh. It was hard to even book the flights. No one spoke the language, and the travel agent that I was using, I mean, you'd send a fax to this Phnom Penh Airways, and they'd answer it in like a week. And that was by fax. There was no email. So when I leave Bangkok, and I'm on a flight to Phnom Penh, and I didn't know this, but on our flight there was like Cambodian royalty, a guy who'd been in exile for years. He was on that flight, and when we arrived in Phnom Penh, that was just like protests about this guy coming back, and there's helicopter warships all hovering around the airport, and this is my introduction to Cambodia. So I stayed in Cambodia, stayed in Phnom Penh, and then a couple of days later, I flew up to Siem Reap, I think it was called. Again, this was a weird situation as well. I'm in an airport. I've got a boarding pass. It's really just a little card that's a color. It's just a piece of cardboard. And there's all these people waiting to get on the flight, and everyone is going to the same place, to Siem Reap. And so a guy comes up to me and says, "Hey, let's see your boarding pass." And he goes, "Oh, it's time for you to board." So I think, oh, I must be like first class or something. I am boarding this plane by myself. And I get on the plane, I'm all comfortable. I see that in the back of the plane are some cases of gear that are my gear, plus some stuff I'm taking up there for Doctors Without Borders, taking it to the next stop. And I'm just expecting everyone else to board in a second. Anyway, we just take off. I'm the only person on the plane. And we fly up there, and again, I'm the only guy on the flight, and we arrive there, and I'm the only person that gets off, and there's a guy waiting for me, a Belgium, not a doctor, but he was with Doctors Without Borders from Belgium. And he met me at the airport, and he kind of took me into the place where I was staying for a couple of days. So I'd gone from Bangkok to Phnom Penh to Siem Reap. Siem Reap is where Angkor Wat is, so that's the old temple. It's a 1,000-year-old temple. Nowadays, 10,000 people go and see it a day. I was there twice. I went twice on that trip. One time I was the only person there, and the other time there was one other guy there. So anyways, I saw the temple, and we traveled a bit by motorcycle and a bit by Isuzu Troopers. That was like a Jeep-like vehicle that could drive through rivers. And we drove up to the next stop, which is a jungle clinic, Sisupon. And that was where the rebel fighters were. People were in the hospital because they stepped on landmines. It was the only clinic around. But most of the people were landmine victims. There was like 1 million landmines still active in the area, and people would, step on them, and cattle would step on them and stuff like that. And the people were, they would fish with them. They would drop them in the water, and when they hit the water, they'd explode, and then the fish would all float up. There was some weird things. And when they were doing stuff like that, sometimes they'd go off and blow their arms off. Anyways, it was a tough part of town. anyways, I stayed there for a couple of weeks, worked with the doctors, and then reversed the whole process back home. I called home once. There was a satellite phone in Phnom Penh, so I'd been gone about 10 days and Mom hadn't heard anything from me because there was no communication. And then after about 10 days, basically all the scary part of the trip was done. I'm now just about 3 or 4 days away from getting home in Phnom Penh, and then back through Bangkok, and then from Bangkok fly, through Taipei to Toronto. So it was an exciting time for me. It was the first time I'd been to that part of the world. It was like being an international journalist, and very exciting. I really developed my personality a lot. I would say for a year, every conversation I had with anybody, I mentioned I just got back from Cambodia. I think it was just that big a deal in my life. And that was probably the most exciting thing I ever did. The scariest thing I ever did was on that very same trip. When we were in Sisupon, so there's landmines everywhere, and we took this certain route to the hospital every day in a Jeep. Like a Jeep. It wasn't a Jeep, but it was like a Jeep. Anyways, we would take this route and we would go by, and the guys would always point out to this one field and say, just watch this field, it's full of landmines because they protect the little town with the landmines. So anyways, somehow I got lost and I ended up walking through this field safely. I just followed footsteps that were ahead of me, but that was the scariest thing in my life, for sure. So Cambodia was the most exciting thing I did, and one component of it was certainly the scariest thing I did. After Cambodia, I would say the next most exciting thing I did was when Hannah and I were in the Bahamas and we went on our first shark dive. So we'd been diving, there'd been some sharks. We didn't really understand the culture of sharks. We were still afraid of them. You do need to respect them, give them space, but once we did the shark dive, we realized that there's a great opportunity to be amongst the sharks. So that was the second most thrilling thing I ever did, was the shark dives. And I remember talking with Hannah afterwards. I would say she thought it was the most thrilling thing too. But I remember talking to her afterwards and saying, why don't we could just stay here. We could just stay here and just do this every day till we ran out of all our money. That wouldn't have been a good idea, but I remember it did cross my mind.